the influences of the media.
Teenage savages go wild in a juvenile jungle of lust and lawlessness.
A flood tide of filth threatening to pervert an entire generation of our American children.
I'm Dr. Ben Litherland.
And I'm Dr. Richard McCulloch.
We research media audiences.
And this is Ill Effects, the good podcast about bad media influences.
Rich.
Hi, Ben.
Today we're going to be talking about a band that are quite underground. I don't know whether you'll have heard of them. They're called the Beatles.
I thought you were going to say my band from when I was 17. We were called the Klimt.
The Klimt. What music did you play?
Oh, God. Just awful.
Have you got... I want to do an episode on the Klimt.
You really don't. The Klimt don't even want to do that.
What do you know about the Beatles? What's your sort of idea about who the Beatles are, what the Beatles were doing?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say like I'm like a super fan of the Beatles, but they have absolutely been a part of my life. I think it's quite hard to avoid them if you were born in this country.
Yeah.
Really, but particularly where I was born, which is not too far from Liverpool, you kind of absorb the Beatles through osmosis.
Yeah.
They're just there in the culture and have been most of my life, really.
Yeah, you're not allowed to live in the Wirral without knowing a couple of Beatles songs.
I mean, I'm not from the Wirral, mate. But,
Where are you from?
Southport.
That's the Wirral, isn't it?
No, it's the other direction. It's north. But anyway.
It's in the Wirral.
Yeah, so the Beatles, I listened to a lot of their songs. I think my biggest engagement with them in terms of not just the music, but the kind of culture around it was when I did film studies when I was, sort of late teens, and we watched A Hard Day's Night in one of my film classes, which was, I want to say, 1964 or 5, one of those. Richard Lester film. Really good movie, fun japes with, the Beatles running through the streets and being chased by fans and, doing gigs and the whole world kind of going crazy for them and things like that.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
So that film is released at the height of Beatlemania and contributes to, we might say, some of the kind of the ideas and the images that circulate particularly around the fans of the Beatles. So the idea of the sort of chasing, screaming, hysterical girls is something that I'm really interested in today and something that I really want to talk about in more detail. The idea of hysteria is something that we're going to come on to. So I've sent you a couple of quotes. This is going to set up the question for today's episode. So the first is a quote from the Boston Globe, which was a front page story that reported that multiple girls had succumbed to hysteria, including one lying face down in a pool of water, overcome by hysteria. In the first aid room, she couldn't remember her name. She complained of pain in her legs. The second quote I'm going to get you to read, because it's got a couple of words in that I don't know how to pronounce, so I'm going to see how you get on with it. But this is from Bob Geldof in Q magazine in 2010.
Okay. I'm not going to offend the nation of Ireland any more than this country already has. So Geldof says, the Beatles was a case of watching females in Excelsis.
Excelsis. There we go.
Well, there's that song Hosanna and Excelsis. It's like a hymn.
There you go.
That's what I'm going to go with.
Cool.
Anyway, the Beatles was a case of watching females in Excelsis. It's the old cliche, but you couldn't hear them for all the screaming. I remember looking down at the cinema floor and seeing these rivulets of piss in the aisles. The girls were literally pissing themselves with excitement. So what I associate most with the Beatles is the smell of girls' urine. I mean, that's pretty rich coming from the lead singer of the Boomtown Rats.
What I associate with Bob Geldof is the smell of piss.
Exactly.
Potentially, probably. I don't know. Sorry, Bob, if you're listening.
He's not listening.
So this idea of girls who are so hysterical. They are being taken to the first aid room. They are collapsing. They are breaking down in an emotional excess that they are so excited that they are literally pissing themselves to the extent that piss is running down the aisles, is essentially the question today. So today what we are exploring is, did the Beatles make fans hysterical?
Right. Can we just talk for a moment about the editorial decision to not call this episode "Did the Beatles Make Fans Piss Themselves?"
It's a very good question. It's a good question to the extent that, like, I kind of still want to, but I don't want to focus too much on piss. Oh. I know on this podcast we've already spoken about people drinking their own piss.
Yeah,
and
that's fair.
Yeah, the idea of hysteria is something that I am interested in, and we will return to them.
Yes. Okay, let's do it.
The idea of mania is obviously really linked to hysteria, and the idea of Beatlemania is something that we just want to dig into. So let's do a little bit of context, the proper background stuff. So Beatlemania was used by the British press to discuss the band's tour in the late around autumn '63. It had been building all year, so this is where they're really kind of pumping out the hit singles, and they're really starting to develop this following of potentially hysterical fans. It kind of gets mainstream press attention, or like it really becomes like a thing. So they play the London Palladium in October 1963, and there's a scuffle between a couple of hundred, maybe 1,000, but a couple of hundred, mostly young women, although something we are going to look at today is that, is it just young women that are doing this? But mostly young women and police officers, and there's some really nice pictures of this sort of stuff.
Yeah, the famous photo of the police officer holding back the big like wall of young girls, and his helmet is like falling off his face. Is that's
absolutely one of them. I'm going to get you to look at some of these images in a little bit. This sort of builds going into the kind of the winter of '64, and then Beatlemania is kind of famously kind of transposed to the US, there are. So when we were pitching ideas of this, I was like, I'll do the Beatles. I bet there's not much written on. There's so much about the Beatles.
Isn't there a journal?
There is a journal of Beatles studies, which I didn't know, but I was like, oh, it'll be fine. There'll be a couple of decent books. There is a lot of stuff. So again, as with all of our episodes, if you want a more like a deep dive into the Ed Sullivan performance, I'm sure that podcast exists. So we're not really going to be covering. We're covering the basics here, but they play Ed Sullivan in February 1964. This in 2024, this blows my mind. 73 million people watch that.
I mean, it's in that era though, isn't it, where there was so few channels.
Yeah,
and TV was the mass medium.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it does make sense, but I know what you mean. Like that. I mean, that I don't know what the population of the US at that point was, but that's got to be maybe half or like close to half.
I've not researched that. Let's say half. Like we'll fact check that. We won't fact check that. That's fine. It's probably half. I don't think
we don't want to do an insert like a. Yeah.
That's like followed by a world tour. They go back to the US later that year. So the kind of the Beatlemania era is sort of 63 to 66.
Yeah.
That's the sort of the time range that we're looking at, and it really, I think, the shock of what Beatlemania is kind of 63, 64. People have sort of got used to it by sort of 65, 66.
Oh, okay.
Which we'll have a think about a little bit later, I think. What happens in the US is what had been happening in the UK for kind of 6, 7, 8 months at that point, which is groups of fans turn up to where they are playing and they make a lot of noise. They're very visible, they're very public, hundreds, potentially thousands of people. Famously, they're met on at the airport when they arrive in New York by a couple of thousand noisy adolescents who are causing a racket and have a lot of attention from the press of the day. So it's something that we're going to explore, I think, that idea of that relationship between the press and the fans themselves. I think what is interesting for this episode, so that question of hysteria is an interesting one, but there is no escaping the fundamental point that in earlier episodes we've looked at the question of effects and actually there's no evidence of the effect that we're kind of talking about.
Yeah.
We are starting with, it's very hard to deny that there weren't young girls who were screaming.
Yes.
That happened. Like, we have the evidence. I'm going to show you some evidence of that now. Like,
right.
Young girls were very, very, very excited about the Beatles. They turned up in their hundreds and their thousands to scream at the Beatles. We have the evidence. Let's have a look at the evidence.
The fans bought half the tickets by post, and then 5,000 queued, some of them for 2 nights, in hope of obtaining the rest. Here are some of the lucky 2,500 who really are going to see the Beatles at the ABC Ardwick, Manchester. The manager makes sure that every member of his staff is ready for the biggest night of the year, able to cope with a terrific audience response evoked everywhere by the Beatles.
What did you make of all that then?
I loved that clip. I mean, in a sense, it's just kind of the way our fans react to us, isn't it? Ben, I think that this is the costs of being such an accomplished podcaster.
Yeah.
But no, in all seriousness,
who's Ringo? There's only 2 of us. We're both Ringo.
You're Pete Best, mate. No, that was a really, really cool clip. Loads of stuff that we could potentially pull out there. I mean, yeah, I guess the first thing to say is, as you said before, this idea of Beatlemania, hysterical fans, whatever word you want to use. There are people there who are making a hell of a lot of noise.
They are excited.
They are really excited. They are, I would say, overwhelmed with emotion. Some of them,
absolutely.
They are, it's like they don't know what to do with themselves in places. Grabbing their hair and shaking it. And one woman was chewing on her coat at one point, which I enjoyed. What I will say though is that wasn't the whole clip. The whole clip wasn't like that, and not everyone was doing that.
Yeah.
So I think that's, the most visible and most striking element of the audience. One thing I was quite surprised at, knowing, that I've seen those kinds of images and heard those stories before. One of the things I thought was interesting was that actually before, so when the fans were waiting to go in, clearly they're very excited.
Yeah.
And there were a few who seemed more excited than others. But generally, I think that was pretty civilized.
Absolutely.
And the way that they were, the staff in the venue were like lining up, and there was like I was a bit fearful. There was like some quite elderly members of staff who I thought, oh God, are they going to get trampled by these little, teeny boppers or whatever? But no, it was all quite, people were excited, big smiles on their faces, but they were walked in an orderly fashion. It was a lot more civilized than, Black Friday sale, those kinds of things. I would also, what else can we talk about? The gender question you mentioned before about whether this is just girls. It's definitely not just girls.
Yeah.
I'd say it's predominantly girls.
Yeah, they are the majority of the audience, but they're certainly not the only people there.
Yeah, there were definitely men there having a brilliant time as well. The Beatles themselves are having a great time. It made me want to go and listen to their songs again because they're just great live performers. And I think my experience of listening to them has predominantly been, the studio recordings for obvious reasons. But like watching them recordings, like I love that you can hear the Scouse accents coming through. When they sing live. I love every time they do that Paul does the little shake of his head when he goes woo, and the whole crowd every time he does it, and he does it a lot.
I'm excited watching it. Like I want to be there.
I want to be there, definitely. Yeah. Can we go there?
We can maybe go there. You have to eat coats because that's a regional delicacy in post-war Manchester. Unfortunately, that's all there was.
Fucking Thatcher. It's all there is left to eat.
What is the weirdest noise you've ever made at a concert?
Wow. I mean, the one that comes to mind is actually not at a concert, but it was when I was at a fan convention, and it was like there was a Star Wars thing, and there were some of the actors on stage, but it was like from the new franchise and things. And then they announced a secret guest, and it's like, "Do you want to meet Harrison Ford?" And I went, ah! Like, I don't. I mean, it might not have been that noise, but I made a kind of an out of body noise, like, because it's not just Han Solo, it's Indiana Jones, like, that kind of like hero worship and big celebrity kind of that I idolised from my childhood, that I did not expect to be there and things like that. Just to be in their presence is kind of something. So I can totally sympathise with.
Yeah,
I can totally relate to those emotions.
I think it's something that we just need to kind of put like straight up. Like, obviously, these girls are very, very excited, but being excited is a fun thing to be.
Yeah.
Being at a pop concert or a rock concert or whatever it is, and allowing yourself the indulgence, I guess, to be as excited as you are, is something that isn't just something that happens to pop fans.
And the same thing would happen when people go clubbing, like nights out, kind of lose themselves a little bit, maybe involving, drugs, alcohol, things like that as well. But that, again, that's kind of part of the appeal for people who are into that. Football, we're both football fans. Same. It's like I am kind of a different person when I watch football matches.
Yeah.
My partner hates it, hates me being in the house watching things. I get everyone else stressed out. The dog is terrified of me when I watch football, even when I think I'm being quite calm.
Yeah. So there was one football game. So I am similar. I dread to think some of the noises that I make. And a very, very important goal was scored, and I was in the ground, and I realised I'd not been breathing properly for the entirety of the game. And when it went up, like the goal went in, and I went up and stood up, and I collapsed under the weight of my own body because I hadn't been breathing. There was no oxygen in my body.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so
Impressive.
I sympathise to some of these people that maybe were overcome, because I guess it's happened to me.
Yeah.
What we've established is that there were fans who were very excited.
Yeah.
Whether we call them hysterical or not is a different question. But there are definitely fans who are very, very, very excited to be seeing the Beatles. It obviously means a lot to them. What I was interested in for this episode was taking it in a slightly different direction. So we do know that, did the Beatles fans make girls hysterical or make fans hysterical? We're on kind of slightly dodgy ground there. But were Beatles fans very excited by the Beatles? Yes.
Yeah.
Whether that is an effect or not is a different question. But absolutely, fans were excited. But what I was interested in is then what the case study allows other people to talk about. So how was this phenomenon, this kind of cultural set of practices that were quite new at the time? It was not the first time that fans had been very excited, but it's probably the first time that there's that level of visibility and that everybody gets to see it. How did politicians and the media and teachers and sociologists and anthropologists and psychologists, they all had opinions about what was happening, and they're quite divergent.
Okay.
There's a New York Times article written in 1964, and it's a slightly playful essay, I think. I hope. It might not be playful, but it reads quite playfully, that's trying to make sense of the Beatles. And I've stolen their four headings. So not all of the things that I'm going to be talking about are necessarily from this New York Times article. Some of it is, some of it isn't. And then I've added two more categories that I think are kind of the dominant interpretations of what is going on. Okay. Why are these girls that excited in that space and that place? The first is the anthropological. The second is the psychological. The third is the socio-economic. The fourth is the moral. And then I'm going to add the sexual and the technological as well. Anthropologists are so weird, man. This is first and foremost. I realise that anthropology has worked really, really hard to address its colonial and racist founding and histories.
Do you want to explain what anthropology is for listeners who?
No, I don't. No, I will do. Anthropology is the study of people. It's the study of kind of human societies and cultures. Yeah. When I say it has a racist and colonial history, I mean exactly that, insofar as it literally emerges as almost always white men going and studying other, in, capital O, in quote marks, other people in their kind of places, and then coming back mostly to Europe or North America to kind of reveal what they found about how other people live around the world. So if any anthropologists are listening, I know there has been loads and loads of work over the last sort of 50, 60 years in an attempt to sort of rescue the discipline from its founding context. Whether that's been successful or not, I don't care or don't know. I don't think it has been successful, I guess, is what I'm kind of saying there. So it isn't to say that anthropological readings of the Beatles are always racist. In the context of the 1960s, it's absolutely straight away. It's just like weird stuff. So I've given you a quote there. Do you want to read the quote? So this is from the New York Times article.
The quote says, "It is generally admitted that jungle rhythms influence the beat of much contemporary dance activity. Every man, according to this theory, is instinctively aboriginal in his feet." Oh, God. "Modern society, with its emphasis on decorum, suppresses a need in man for uninhibited kinetic self-expression."
Uninhibited kinetic self-expression.
I'm not sure what that means, but maybe we'll unpack that in a second. "Today's music is a throwback or tribal atavism. It is probably no coincidence that the Beatles, who provoke the most violent response, resemble in manner the witch doctors." What?
So I when I was reading this, I was the same. I was like, oh, okay, yeah, we'll do. Why not? A bit of casual 60s racism, of course. And then I got to the witch doctors bit, and I was like, even in your own racist logic, what are you on about? Yeah. Which witch doctors?
Who are the witch doctors in that? Are the Beatles the witch doctors?
Yes.
What, like casting some kind of voodoo magic on the unsuspecting fans or something
men,
like that?
There is a deep Aboriginal person who lives inside of us that wants to dance freely. It's do we need to dwell on it? Do you have any more? Like it's racist. It's really weird racist. Like I don't quite know what is going on here. Variety. In the same week, used this idea and then speculated that Beatlemania might be a phenomenon closely linked to the current wave of racial rioting.
What? Which racial rioting did they mean? I'm trying to rationalize. I shouldn't even be asking questions like that, should I?
Yeah. So I mean, it is the 60s. So we're at the peak of the sort of like the civil rights era. So there is racial rioting going on, and then there's just people drawing lines between the Beatles and rightly people protesting for basic human rights, and I suppose using the weirdest anthropology that you've ever read.
And they think that those people were inspired to do it by the Beatles.
I'm not sure. I don't know what they're thinking. I suppose they're saying that there's a fundamental force in society and that different outlets are providing the space for that. I don't know. I'm done with this. Let's move on. So that's one of the readings. I'm moving on to even worse stuff. Okay. Number 2. Mine and your favourite discipline in academia, the psychological explanation. So every time I do the research for one of these episodes, I'm like, maybe the psychologists will be normal this time. Maybe they'll have a normal take. Maybe they'll have a reasoned and rational... They don't have a reasoned and rational discussion.
But they've done experiments, Ben.
So... again, this might need a little bit of unpacking before we get to the quote. Have we mentioned Adorno on the podcast before?
I think in passing. I don't think we've done his work.
Yeah, this dickhead. I quite like Adorno. I don't know why I'm calling him a dickhead. I don't know, because every time I read him, I'm like, you dickhead, but like in a fun way. He's like a mate who's a bit of a dickhead, but you get on with him. Okay. You're like, that's funny. What are you on about? He's had 2 pints. He's getting all worked up about the Beatles. For our listeners who don't know who Adorno is, do you want to do the quickest summary?
Theodore Adorno is most. He's one of the critical theorists. He's associated with something called critical theory. He was a Marxist scholar who emigrated from Germany in the 1940s or late 30s, just before the kind of war, basically, the 30s, emigrated to America and then spent many years slagging off popular culture, getting very angry about it and thinking about the effects of ideology and things like that.
So famously tried to blend Marx and Freud. So that's how he's ended up here in the psychological explanation for the Beatles. So again... this writer for the New York Times is trying to summarize what they think are the key discourses. So we're already a little bit removed from Adorno. Adorno never wrote about the Beatles, as far as I'm aware. But he did write about a form of dance called the jitterbug. And this New York Times columnist is using Adorno's work on the jitterbug to try and summarize what might be happening with the Beatles. Do you want to read that quote for me?
Yeah. Whether dancing or merely listening and jumping, those taking part are working off the inner tensions that bedevil a mixed-up psyche. The singer performs a healing role. To Beatle, as to jitter, is to lose one's identity in automatized, insect-like activity. In other words, to obey. Wow.
Yeah. So it's a psychological desire to be dominated by the systems of which we all belong, of which Adorno thinks the jitterbug, with its repetitive mechanical movements, represents an expression of living under capitalism, and the Beatles and their fans are offering a similar.
I love that he's turned Beatle into a verb.
It's so good.
To Beatle.
To Beatle. As to jitter.
Do you know there's a verb in Spanish which is achaplinarse, which means to run away.
Achaplinarse?
Achaplinarse, which translates as to run away in the manner of Charlie Chaplin.
Oh, brilliant. That's genuinely amazing.
Yeah.
Lovely. Yeah. Excellent. The second quote, so I've not taken this from the New York Times. I read this, and it was probably the wildest journal article I've read in a very, very long time. We'll chat about it afterwards, but I just want you to read it. Like, I've just got it because I want to hear your voice say these words out loud. So this is a psychological explanation of what is happening with the Beatles.
The Beatles, probably unconsciously, are servants of the white goddess.
Don't consciously serve the white goddess.
Who is the white goddess?
Go on.
All right, okay. The Beatles, probably unconsciously, are servants of the white goddess. She is elaborately catered to in their poetic content. All these are symbolic representations pertaining to the white goddess, but search as one will in the earlier Beatle literature, there is no sign of the red goddess of fruition. What the fuck does that mean? Who are these? Like,
it's using a literary Jungian analysis, and there's
like archetypes.
Yeah, I think so. My eyes were rolling into the back of my head so often in this article that I was like, what is going on here? I genuinely love that in the 1960s. So this is written in 1969. That I think you could just drop acid and then just say mad shit to your PR, I guess, and you didn't have to do any emails, and you just be like, the white goddess and the red goddess.
This is published in an academic journal. Someone peer reviewed this and went, yes.
They were also on acid. I think as a bonus episode, if we ever get to 100,000 episodes, we should take acid together and just riff on this idea of a goddess.
Oh, God.
That can just be a bonus. We'll watch Modern Culture and be like, I've got some ideas.
But can
Caroline, hit record.
Can we please not have to read psychological journal articles, though, when we do it?
No one's reading anything in the 1960s. That's my favourite. It's just just riff on the idea of a goddess. It is so good. It is meaningless gibberish. I think what they're saying is in the Beatles songs, there's a lot of use and there's a lot of calls to action. I think that I don't care. We don't need to spend ages on it. But I genuinely love that somebody could publish that.
My life is now worse for having heard that. So thank you.
It's going to get worse before it gets better.
Oh, amazing.
I'll have you read it because I genuinely am enjoying hearing your disdain. So this is another quote that was pulled from a newspaper of the time.
The girls are subconsciously preparing for motherhood. Their frenzied screams are a rehearsal for that moment. Oh, fucking hell. Even the jelly babies...
So I'll interrupt you. So girls used to throw jelly babies on stage because it was the Beatles' favourite sweet.
Okay, even the jelly babies are symbolic. Oh...
They are chucking their motherhood onto the stage and preparing themselves psychologically for childbirth.
And so they're screaming
Yeah.
to prepare themselves to hear a baby screaming.
Or their own screams, I think.
Of like
The
childbirth.
screams of childbirth, yeah. That's a psychological preparation.
Can we move on to the next section? It's just...
If any psychologists are listening, can you tell your discipline? Just like chill out, guys. Like,
They're just walking around, just like, yeah, as you say, like this isn't based on anything.
just be normal.
Where's the research in there? Again, was that a journal article?
I think that was pulled from a newspaper that had interviewed a psychologist. So
And that's the soundbite they came out with.
it's a soundbite they came out with.
Wow. Cool.
Fortunately, we're through some of the wilder takes. So we're on to interpretations that I start to feel a little bit more happy and comfortable with. So we're into the socio-economic explanation. Broadly speaking, this points to the context in which this is happening and starts to kind of dig through things that might have contributed to girls feeling this excited. So things like consumer culture. So, you know, if you've watched Mad Men or any of those sorts of shows that are set in this context, we kind of know, particularly in the US, but elsewhere as well, we've got the expansion of kind of consumer culture. So even at the time, people are saying the kinds of arguments that essentially amount to young people have more money, more time, they're spending their money on records and magazines, and therefore this is downstream from the fact that we live in a consumer culture where people are starting to build their identities from, you know, mass market, mass consumer cultural items.
Yeah. There's a few different, I guess, flashpoints in that history, aren't there? And some of them come before this, like the age of the flapper in the 1920s and those kinds of things, for example.
Yeah.
But yeah, this is kind of like another kind of a fillip in that history, I guess.
Yeah, and you can do like the history of the idea of the teenager, which again, I don't think the teenager in kind of some popular histories, it's like, and then the 60s came along and the teenager came along with them. And I think you can, as you've kind of indicated, the 1910s, 1920s, 1930s, certainly in UK youth culture, the idea of the teenager is already quite established. The idea of like teenagers having pocket money to spend, being in full-time education, even like the longer history of childhood, I think you need to account for the kind of the 19th century, the idea of like schooling and the idea of like not being in the workforce until 6 and then 11 and then 14 and then 16 and then kind of as you get into the kind of 50s, possibly even 18. Although I think a lot of people would have left school at 16. So there is a quite interesting chart of like quite early on, the Beatles fans seem to be a little bit older and they kind of get younger as the kind of 60s continue.
Oh, okay.
Which possibly speaks to the fact that, again, there's no getting away from the fact that like baby boomers, the idea of the baby boom of, you know, post-war birth rates, rocketing for many, many reasons, and that creating a lot of consumers in the 1960s.
Yeah. And I think the whole idea of the invention of the teenager, I hopefully goes without saying, but it's not that obviously teenagers, literally in terms of the age, has been around for a while, but the idea of that as a distinct period of your life, being an adolescent, like between childhood and adulthood, I think it becomes more visible at this moment, rather than necessarily like becoming an entirely new category. Like, because there's loads of, as well as the Beatles and Beatlemania and things like that, you've got panics around juvenile delinquency and rock and roll music, which before the Beatles, I mean, Elvis, Rebel Without a Cause, Blackboard Jungle,
all of that kind of stuff. And on the other side of the Atlantic, the kind of mods and rockers, the famous case study, Quadrophenia, the moral panics around mods and rockers. The idea that, teenagers have been invented. I do quite like the idea that teenagers are literally invented in a lab by a mad capitalist. Up until the 1960s, you went from childhood to adulthood in like overnight.
It's the kind of thing that Elon Musk would invent if it didn't already exist, I'm sure. Just to sell more stuff too.
Yep. And as all of that is tied up, as you say, there is a lot of this idea of like teenage rebellion, the narratives of protest. Somebody, the New York Times article says, it's a form of protest against the adult world. Those youngsters are hoping to believe in something or respond to something new that they have found for themselves. So the idea that through fandom you can build something that exists outside of a reasonably conservative, hegemonic sort of world where you go to school and then you get a job and then you settle down in suburbia yourself. So we're beginning to see things that we take for granted now, but at the level and at the mass scale of the 1960s. So it certainly existed beforehand. And it certainly exists afterwards. But that idea of like a snapshot of the Beatles giving us something that perhaps had never been at that level, that scale before. There's other things taking place in society and in culture. It certainly wasn't the only time, as you've kind of already indicated. In the 40s, Frank Sinatra fans, the idea of turning up to music venues and being rowdy or causing a kind of mini riot that the police have to get involved in. So certainly isn't the first time, but again, at the kind of level of the scale that's kind of taking place. The idea of the teenager as a consumer, as perhaps one of the kind of consumers with the most disposable income to spend. The idea of kind of post-war economy booming and the teenagers or younger people having more money than almost anyone else to spend, and that kind of creates these cultural texts in and of themselves. That the kind of cultural text is downwind from that. I thought this was quite interesting. So there's a thesis that's become quite popular in Beatles study stuff, and again, almost a kind of immediately older people were kind of suggesting that this was the case. So a couple of months before the Beatles land in New York, JFK is assassinated. And there's a sense, particularly in America, that young people were particularly emotionally affected by this. So the arrival of the Beatles allows for a sort of more positive view of the world, that they've been kind of really depressed. They'd had a difficult few months, and the Beatles gives them an outlet. Which again, I'm like you. I'm not sure anything is ever that neat.
I quite, to be honest, that's the kind of explanation that maybe if there are psychologists listening to this, they'd be going, well, that's just like our white goddess and red goddess thing. It's just as, just some kind of like bullshit kind of, anecdotal, sorry, banging the desk there. Story that sounds nice, but actually there's no evidence behind it. But I admit I'm sort of, I don't want to say sympathetic towards these in the sense that I believe them, but I quite like hearing these readings, even though I don't generally buy into them that much. They're quite fun, sort of like, oh, this big global event was going on, and then all these kind of, like, say this thing happens in politics, and then this stuff happens in popular culture. Like, it's often a bit too neat when people make those arguments.
It's very neat, isn't it?
I quite like them as sort of just an idea, something to discuss. Like,
I'm like you. I wonder if there are psychologists who read the goddess stuff and like they're like, oh, come on, but they're sympathetic to it. Like they're kind of getting something. I'm like you. Of like, I always enjoy it in like September 11th being a big one, and like movies that were like completely, they were already produced and edited, and they get released in the weeks after September 11th. People like, this is a post September 11th movie. You're like, are you sure? But like, I'm still quite sympathetic.
Right. And like, as soon as Donald Trump got elected, we're like, let's do a book on horror movies in the age of Trump and stuff like that. And I quite like hearing those arguments and those readings, but I don't know. Again, I just think it's a bit too neat, a bit too simplistic.
Because I think ultimately there is a relationship between society and culture.
Of course,
and our job, job as cultural critics, jobs as academics, is to try and interrogate that. And
we cultural critics, Ben.
I've got a podcast, so that's what I'm starting to call myself.
Amazing.
No one else is calling me that yet, but all the kids are saying Ben Litherland.
My kids don't call me cultural critic.
If you played them the band, they should be playing them the hits.
No, they'll just leave home immediately if I play them that.
I'm just going to show you a clip that is of an American news reporter who is trying to describe the Beatles to a mass audience, and then he interviews the Beatles.
And this is Beatleland, formerly known as Britain, where an epidemic called Beatlemania has seized the teenage population, especially female. Some of the girls can write, and they belong to the Beatle fan club. The Beatles sound like insect life, but it's spelled B-E-A-T, beat. And these four boys from Liverpool with their dish mop hairstyles are Britain's latest musical and, in fact, sociological phenomenon. They have introduced what their press agents call the Mersey sound, after the River Mersey on which Liverpool stands. And though musicologists say it is no different than any other rock and roll, except maybe louder, it has carried the Beatles to the top of the heap. In fact, they have met royalty, and royalty is appreciative and impressed. Wherever the Beatles go, they are pursued by hordes of screaming, swinging juveniles. They and their press agents have to think up all sorts of ways to evade their adoring fans. Thousands of teenagers in every city and town stand in line all night to get tickets for their touring show. Girls faint when the tickets run out. The other night, the Beatles played Bournemouth, the South Coast family resort, and Bournemouth will never be the same. Reporter Josh Darsa talked to the Beatles in their dressing room.
What has occurred to you as to why you've succeeded?
I don't know, really. You know, as you say, the haircuts, we didn't think they were a gimmick, but everyone else said, oh, what a gimmick.
What is the Mersey sound? How does it differ from other rock and roll and pop?
It doesn't really. It's just happened that all of a sudden hundreds of rock groups, all from Liverpool, made records, and it was a bit more like the original rock and roll than the stuff they've had over the last few months. So people decided suddenly, you know, there's all these Liverpool groups, so they call it the Liverpool sound and the Mersey beat and everything else.
And the Nicky Cuffle thing.
Yeah, but it's just, yeah.
It's just a way of classifying it, but I don't think the music's very different.
Do you have any fears that your public eventually will get tired of you and move on to a new favorite?
Well, they probably will, but, you know...
You ever think about
Depends how long it takes for them to get tired.
Yeah.
Don't it?
It's stupid to worry about things like that, because, I mean, it could...
It's not worth missing your sleep for, is it?
No,
boring. No.
It could happen tomorrow, and it could, you know, we could have quite a run. We just hope we are going to have quite a run.
Thank you, Ben. That was great. I love how I've never heard anyone be so dismissive of like any interview. Like that's really quite. You know, like he's reading it out like he's a hostage video, kind of like, you know, he's obviously I know it's called being a news reader, but like he's so obviously reading it off the page and
the
not invested
in his voice.
Yeah, like that they spell it B-E-A-T, so it's like a joke because you have a beat in music. But it sounds like Beatles the Insect, and this new other band is called One Direction, but actually sometimes they walk in two directions. Like I love it, loved it. And I enjoyed the Beatles themselves, like, you know, batting it away and just being like, "Come on, man!" Well, did you ever see that interview with Elliott Smith on like
No.
so the singer-songwriter Elliott Smith? He's on like the Good Will Hunting soundtrack, and think the people who don't really know him. But yeah, like this really cool like indie kind of singer-songwriter in the 1990s who was really like shy, introverted, quiet man. And being interviewed on like some kind of MTV or like really obnoxious American like Saturday morning program, and they're like, "What's it going? What's it like? Your new record's out," and he's just like, "Oh God, leave me alone!" Like he looks so upset. He's like, "I just wrote it about this thing. Please stop."
Yeah, I think it captures really nicely the relationship between like one generation of parents and certainly not all parents. Some parents were quite into the Beatles as well. Like, again, whenever you've got 73 million people watching something, there's going to be so many different takes. But it does capture a dominant voice in that coverage, which is one of like disdain and frustration and patronizing. And like you say, I think one of the things that makes the Beatles very attractive is they bat it away. They're playful with it. They tell me as an audience, I'm not taking this guy seriously, but they don't do it in a way that's like Sex Pistols 10, 15 years later where they're swearing. And it's quite playful. They're quite silly. They're amusing themselves.
But it's also not particularly rude.
And it's not particularly rude. Yeah. So we've had the anthropological, we've had the psychological, we've had the socio-economic. We're moving into the moral. So I think you get a little bit of that morality about parents and adults who are For them, they're trying to read Beatlemania through the lens of moral decline, I suppose, when I say moral. The idea that what is taking place in society, that we are losing something, that this is expressing a deeper, more worrying or problematic trend of wider society. I've got loads of quotes. You could genuinely pull hundreds of these together. We could do a book on people saying ridiculous, wild stuff about the Beatles. I've zoomed in on stuff that I just think kind of captures aspects of it. So the New York Times kind of summarizes this viewpoint as the violent and spectacular diversions of the young are taking place in a moral vacuum caused by the abdication of their elders. That's, there's not loads to say about this. Like, every youth culture before and since somebody makes something similar, where are the parents? I think we've heard it on podcasts or on this podcast already, like variations of that. So we don't need to dwell on it. Paul Johnson, in one of the all-time dog shit takes about the Beatles, like, I want to achieve several things doing this podcast, but if I can have a take so terrible that people are still bringing it up 70 years later, that's all I want. It's all I'm aiming for. His take: those who flock around the Beatles, who scream themselves into hysteria, whose vacant faces flicker over the TV screen, are the least fortunate of their generation. The dull, the idle, the failures.
I mean, come on. Get out and watch them. They're great. And they're so pretty, and they're good singers and good performers.
Let yourself go, Paul.
Live a little, yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of people who should let themselves go, we've got David Noble for Christian Crusade, who called them 4 mop-headed Antichrist beatniks. He published a pamphlet, which is one of my favourite pamphlet titles, I think, of all time, having discovered it in researching this. And the pamphlet is called Communism, Hypnotism, and the Beatles. He claimed that the Beatles represent a particular threat from the Soviet Union. He claimed it took the communist scientists and psychopoliticians to devise a means of combining the use of hypnotism and music to nerve jam the children of a nation without our leaders, teachers, or parents being aware of its implications.
What does he think, that they're brainwashing
communism
people, right,
into Satanism and communism?
Based on what? How is Love Me Do?
Based on what? He's also taking
only
acid.
Communists want to hold my hand. Like I want to have my own hand in my own house, and that's it.
I mean, this is one of those interesting things that, again, we've seen this repeated in different variations and guises, but the idea of like a hidden threat that is underneath, particularly American culture. It's often a communist threat, but it isn't always. But it's Satanist or communist or both, and that they are using popular culture as the thin end of a wedge to sneak in. Like you say, what exactly? But degeneracy,
Yeah, I mean, we could do an entire, probably a series of episodes on Cold War American anti-communism, because it's just I only learned about that side of American culture when I went to university and did American history there. But like, it's wild how crazy it is. It makes no sense to me. Even as someone who'd never been particularly political before, to just come across people who hated those ideas so much was just wild.
Yeah, and to Americans listening, we have our own weirdos.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Your weirdos are quite loud and special. Like, they are particularly, especially weirdos. Weird.
The other thing, which isn't specifically about that quote, but I think just generally, like, he called them 4 mop-headed Antichrist beatniks. The hair. The focus on the hair has always confused me. Like, and it was mentioned in that.
Yeah, no, it was something that kind of was repeated over.
Like the fact that they had longer than average hair.
Yeah,
it's really not that long. And also, even if it was longer than the average for the time, why is that a sign of moral decline?
Well, you're living in a world where the decline has already happened and Satan has already had his way with you. So
I am one of the Antichrist beatniks.
Yeah, so you accept it now. First the hair, second the world, I guess. I included this for a couple of reasons. I enjoy it because I want to bully this nerd so much on a podcast that that's why I've included it. I just want to laugh at some guy. But I also think it's interesting that even within like the idea of the teenager, there was loads of people who hated the Beatles. There was like anti-Beatles fans. There were groups of people that similarly made similar claims to like some of the wilder kind of parent takes. So this high schooler writes to a local newspaper. Again, this is in 1964, and says, "Rock and roll music isn't the best type of music. It seems to bring out the worst in teenagers."
Oh God, one of those kids.
Nerd. Like what? What are you doing, man? Just reflect on your life choices. Like, come on. You're writing to the press and being like, "I'm not like those other teenagers."
You haven't included his name here on the quotes. Like, should we not name and shame?
No, he's a nerdy high schooler. That's right. All I've got. There's a judge who, one of my all-time favourite stories, and the research that I came out doing. So there was a bit of a trend, again, really, really small. I don't think the Beatles are causing this, but there's a bit of a trend of American girls running away from home and getting as far to the UK that they're able to live in the UK for days and even weeks at a time.
For what purpose? Because they want to be near the Beatles.
So that was the narrative in the press. These were big press stories, and the idea that they've run away from home to go and see the Beatles. So they're just living in 1960s Liverpool or London and just hanging out. So this story, one of the girls stole her college fund and managed to live in London for like genuinely for weeks.
Fair play.
She rented a little flat, her and her friend. And as always with these stories, like when you dig into it, like possibly actually an unhappy home life. Again, a kind of yearning for freedom, actually. Teenage girls, kind of older teenage girls living in a reasonably suffocating kind of conservative environment. Just going, fuck it, I'm going to go where I can. But also under the pretext of the Beatles. So I don't think it's this exact story, but there is another similar story where the girl does leave a note that said, "I've gone to find the Beatles." That's all. Right. That's all that's left. So like, you can see why the press are interested in it. The girls are found, and that's a big story in itself. And then they're returned home. Whoever did this, I love. This is such a funny part of the story. The Rolling Stones are touring near their hometown, and they put them on the guest list. And it goes to court. The judge puts a banning order on these girls going to see the Rolling Stones. And in his concluding remarks, says that teenagers going to concerts alone is like feeding narcotics to teenagers. It's very dangerous. It could very well lead to riots. So they don't get to go see the Rolling Stones.
Oh. Did they get to see the Beatles?
They didn't get to see the Beatles, but they did get to have like a 3-week holiday and swing in London. Yeah. And it sounds, she's written an autobiography of her experiences. Like, it genuinely sounds like she had a lovely time.
And then didn't have to go to college because there was no money left to do it. So amazing. Got out of that as well.
Win, win, win. Yeah. What interested me whilst I was researching this is, as people who are interested in fan culture, we've researched it professionally, but we're also, belonging to fans. That idea of like the badly behaved audience, whether that's a pop concert or the theatre, it just never disappears. It's always in the discourse of like fans aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing. Have you got any examples from recently that sort of spring to mind? Yeah,
I don't know how recent all of that. There's always stories like this cropping up in research and in media reports as well. Kirsty Sedgman has done some really interesting research on theatre audiences and talks about theatre etiquette and reasonable behaviour and stuff. I remember her talking about crowds of young girls who were fans of Benedict Cumberbatch going to see him in, Shakespearean plays and things like this at the National Theatre and those sorts of like prestigious venues. And news reports, particularly in the Telegraph, I seem to remember, being, like theatre critics being like, "Oh, I can't believe these savages have, turned up and ruined the theatre experience for everyone." Yeah. There's various stories all the time of like people throwing stuff onto stage at like concerts, like throwing stuff at singers. Taylor Swift, I think there was a story about recently. But it's also not anything new. I've been in plenty of crowds my whole life when it's football crowds. Notoriously, there's people say horrendous things or throw stuff that they shouldn't be throwing. I've been in a lot of festival crowds where people have pissed into a cup and lobbed it really far.
I was going to ask you what's the worst thing you've ever seen, and that still...
I've seen that multiple times.
As a 16-year-old watching somebody piss into a cup and then throw it, and then like 10 minutes later you get hit by a beer that somebody's thrown, and you're like...
Is it a beer?
Was that a beer? For the rest of my life, if I get hit with beer at a festival, I'm like...
Yeah.
I'm not going to think about that too much.
And then I suppose, like, post-COVID, we've had a lot of conversations about that, good and bad behaviour, like how do we behave again after having been in lockdown for so long, and have people forgotten how to be nice to each other, and those sorts of moral questions. Like,
as long as I've been going to pop concerts or kind of music festivals, the idea that the crowd is worse behaved than in previous iterations, it's an interesting one. But that idea of moral decline, at some point, in this narrative, there probably had to be like a good time, but like no one who's ever lived through it has gone, do you know what? I think we're living in the most morally pure time that's ever existed. You never hear that.
I think it's often connected to other things though, isn't it? As you could suggest, like, so technology is a big one. I remember a big thing around mobile phones in cinemas, like, theatre, like cinema etiquette and things like that. Is it okay to be texting on your phone while you're watching a movie? I remember the Alamo Drafthouse in Texas did a really good ad campaign about etiquette in their cinemas, and it was basically they just played a voicemail from a woman who'd been kicked out for using her phone, the light on her phone, to find her seat, and she was obviously drunk, and she's going, I was just using my phone to find my seat, all right? You know what? I'm not going to come to your crappy ass theater anymore anyway. It was great. So I enjoyed that. That was my favourite thing that's happened in the last few years with audiences.
The fifth reading, so I've added it. So we're into the couple that I've added now, and this borrows from kind of feminist readings. It kind of places it again into kind of a longer history of what is happening with girlhood, and it does centre the idea of that there is a sexual pleasure attached to Beatlemania, which again, I'm reasonably sympathetic to. I'm not kind of necessarily opposed to this. It takes place almost immediately in the press. Some of these kind of readings, I don't love them, but I kind of see where they're coming from. And then particularly when you listen to girls who then become women and they kind of explain what might be happening there. There's something interesting, but I'll walk you through it. A psychological journal has a really fluff piece about like what might be going on here, and one of the kind of doctors says adolescents are going through a strenuous period of emotional and physical growth, which leads to a need for expressiveness, especially in girls. Boys have sport as an outlet. Girls have only the screaming and swooning afforded by Beatlemania, which could be seen as a release of sexual energy.
That's all they've got, them. They only have the screaming and swooning.
More kind of cultural critic orientated people, it's similar stuff. I think what you said before of like, I think sometimes psychologists and people who are working in sort of a sociology discipline, they're kind of actually grasping at similar interpretations. They're just using very different methods and language. In the years since, kind of people have kind of claimed it was rebellious, especially for the very young fans, to lay claim to sexual feelings. It was even more rebellious to lay claim to the active, desiring side of a sexual attraction. The Beatles were objects, the girls were pursuers. So you see this in kind of many, many books, kind of lots and lots of interpretations of like the Beatles provide a safe avenue for kind of oncoming adolescent sexual feelings, which again, I think that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think that seems fine. There's a famous essay in one of the books that helps to establish fan studies as a discipline. Have you read the
Barbara Ehrenreich?
Yes.
I have, but it was many years ago, and I wouldn't want you to test me on it.
No, I wasn't going to test you, but it is quite a famous essay. And they link the idea of Beatlemania to an emergent kind of second wave feminism. Yeah, that idea of again the pop fandom being a space to publicly, and I think the publicness is kind of important, of like expressing kind of an emergent gendered sexuality that had been suppressed at earlier points in history.
I don't even need. I mean, yes, in the context there, you would say that maybe, but I mean, we still have boy bands today who I would say perform a pretty similar role.
Yeah, absolutely.
I don't think that's a particularly controversial reading.
No, I think, again, there's a neatness to being like Beatle and second wave feminism, but I think broadly for loads of these fans, the central point of like it allowed in a very safe way for people to start to experiment and express a form of heterosexuality. Like, that's fine. It's cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think people use pop culture as a tool for understanding their own sexuality and sexual development generally.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And pop bands are a key part of that. They're not the only part, but
yeah. And whilst there's a neatness to being like Beatlemania and second wave feminism happening at the same time, I think, all of those things are downwind from bigger cultural social changes. So I think you can link them, but the idea of the girl as a visible kind of urban public figure, we've spoken about consumption and fashion and the kind of figure of the girl who kind of uses consumption as a way to participate in society, all of those kind of bigger things. I think that is happening. You can see that in the 1960s.
But presumably this was a source of concern for people who didn't like second wave feminism.
Absolutely.
As well.
So all of these kind of different approaches, I think there are overlaps.
Yeah.
So I think in sometimes, the moral crusaders and the feminist people, they probably agree on the interpretation, but it's then what you do with the interpretation politically.
Yeah. I guess it's even more pronounced with like Elvis, right? Because it was like, I can't believe he's moving his hips like that.
Absolutely,
and like that's so sexualized.
So that is interesting, that the Beatles potentially do the same thing, but it is a little bit safer.
Yeah, I think so.
They are a safer kind of outlet for this, whereas I think Elvis Presley is very linked to African American music and very linked to a sexual identity that I think the Beatles maybe don't have in quite the same way. I found a quote that I'm not sure if it even fits, but I just loved it so much because I think it actually captures some of these tensions that we're talking about. So Gloria Steinem, a reporter of the time, asked a girl who claimed to passionately be in love with Ringo. She asked her, would you actually go on a date with him? And she looks startled and she says, I don't think so. I hardly know him.
I mean,
it's so sweet.
I feel that, like,
absolutely, yeah.
There's so many people who I love and admire from a distance, like in pop culture and things.
Yeah.
Who I just, if I met them in real life, I have nothing to say to them. I not even out of being starstruck necessarily.
Yeah.
Just I just wouldn't know what to do.
Yeah.
Like we've got nothing to start with.
Yeah. And I love that kind of the tension in the respectability politics, particularly that girls are having to kind of maintain of like, you do have to be sexual, but at the same time, you can't be too sexual. Like all of these contradictions and the messiness of trying to navigate a world that is designed to sort of like be against you, I suppose. And I just like that she's trying to kind of manage that respectability politics of, on the one hand, she's out in public, she's screaming, and she wants Ringo to know that she's there. But also she's like, who do you think I am?
Yeah.
There's something just very, sweet. I just really enjoy it as a quote. Last but not least, in kind of the readings and interpretations of like what is going on with Beatlemania, there's just a kind of sense of that the Beatles are obviously very talented musicians. They do really, really interesting stuff, but they're kind of just in the right place at the right time.
Yeah.
Their manager and the people around them, and those themselves, they deal with the mass media. But this is at the point where radio and television, as you've already indicated, it's at the first point in history where enough people have television that they can be that excited about a band that is visiting from the UK. Like, we have much longer histories of celebrity. We have kind of much longer histories of being excited that somebody is coming over to put on a play or there's going to be a boxing fight, but it's a lot slower. So the idea of like television being able to be kind of almost live or actually live in the 1960s, that people in America know who the Beatles are already and they've seen how other fans are responding. So I think there is an interesting conversation to have here about a slightly different type of effects, but the idea of like modelling a type of performance and a type of fandom.
And then you get into debates around authenticity and things. Like, it reminds me of a lot of, again, like I'm a football fan, but like seeing fans of a British football team who the team then goes on a pre-season tour to like Malaysia or Thailand or Hong Kong or somewhere like that, and then the fans there will sing the same songs as the fans back in Anfield and Liverpool and things like that. It's and some people will then have debates about whether they're doing it the right way and stuff.
Absolutely,
and some of those debates are kind of like a bit problematic and things, but they're really interesting as well. And there is something about what is the appropriate way to behave, and how do people learn how to be fans of this latest new band or whatever it is.
So our producer Rachel, who does amazing work on this, she kind of spotted in the crowd, like you can sometimes see when the audience think they're being watched, that idea of like performing to the camera as well. Like there's a very deep sense in some of this stuff that I think you can see the fans themselves being like, okay, I'm going to do fan behaviour.
I think, the clip that you showed before, it was quite noticeable that the Beatles were doing that as well. I know that's not entirely new, but like it was very much a newsreel, which was not just a standoff kind of observer from afar kind of thing.
Yeah.
The Beatles were engaging with the camera, looking right into it in close up and sort of getting their personality across in a way which wouldn't have been done probably even 10 years earlier.
Yeah, and I think there's something really interesting in that as well. So the famous, when the plane arrives at New York Airport and you've got 3,000 fans that turn up, there's also apparently 200 reporters.
Right.
So 6 or 7%, give or take, of the people who are there to report on what is happening. So they are just as visible a presence in the kind of stampede and all the narratives that are taking place there. And again, I'm not saying these aren't authentic reactions, but I think there is an element of performance here. I think there's an element of performing a particular fan identity, knowing that you are being watched. There's something quite interesting there. The idea of like the global media event, the idea of the kind of global fan base who sort of already know what the expectations are of them, and freely and gladly and willingly give that.
Because it's fun, like we said before.
And because it looks fun.
It looks amazing. Why wouldn't you want to do the thing that you've seen other people doing and it looks
They
great
look
fun?
like they're having fun, And so that question of effects of like, I think we've always been clear of like, of course, the media can shape and influence, but it's never, what's happened here is that this band have caused this type of reaction, and it's really, really, really direct.
Yeah.
I think there's something there's something really interesting about the management and the band themselves being really smart with the media, of encouraging it. So I think the Beatles have a very love-hate relationship with this era of their career. Like, it probably isn't that fun being mobbed by fans. Probably makes for quite good footage.
Yeah.
Probably being sent out into the crowds. There's probably something about that. And the idea of reproduction. So the media is a reproduction tool rather than it kind of producing types of feelings. It kind of puts itself in the middle of something. It's a node in a network as opposed to a kind of binary mode of communication.
And I imagine the reference I talked about before, in A Hard Day's Night, the film, that opening scene with them being chased, that's probably something that had already happened to them, but then is put into a film, and then people see the film, and then they sort of copy that. So it's sort of like a back and forth.
It's a narrative
kind of
decision of like, we want early Beatles to be associated with these particular types of fans. And I think, again, there's something quite interesting there that we could possibly discuss. In terms of like modern fandom, the idea of being that visible, I think, is quite a new thing, and it's something that we live with at pop concerts, of like the amount of like phones that are out, and again, that I'm starting to moralize it, but the idea of like phoning other people's bad behavior, or like the idea that there are expectations about what it is to be a fan, whether that's a kind of football fan or a pop music fan. This is possibly the first generation of what they're learning to live with, is being visible. That if you are, on the streets, the mass media might turn up and they will film you, and you can end up on television.
Yeah. And especially if you're waving and jumping around and looking dead excited, rather than just waiting in line very patiently.
What I think we can take from all of this, we've established there's a real long history of the idea of the crowd as being a problem or an issue, but I suppose more interestingly, being a text in itself that people can read. That if you take a photo of this crowd, you can say, this is what this crowd means. It says something about history or politics or the time that we live in or changing behaviours or other things. And it produces all of these discourses, these kind of secondary discourses about what the crowd is. And I think we've both, there's interpretations that we dislike, there's interpretations that we're a little bit more sympathetic to. There's something kind of really understandable about that. Like the idea of wanting a crowd to mean something, I am intrigued by. Like I appreciate that feeling of like, surely this tells us something about the world that we live in currently. I think there's a phrase that I use in my teaching a lot, and you've kind of already indicated this, I think, a little bit of like, what happens when we turn a crowd into a text and then that we say it has meaning? Like, it just provides an outlet. It provides like a lightning rod for discussion.
Yeah.
It's really hard to talk about macro social changes and how they are impacting our own subjectivities. It's really difficult to do that in the abstract.
Yeah.
I think when you have a pop cultural text, it just allows you to be able to have those conversations in it gives you something to hang your hat on, I suppose.
That's really interesting. I've not really thought much about that, to be honest, but that's. I'd love to know if you know much about the longer history of crowds as texts. I would like to read a longer history of that, Ben. But it's because it's certainly something that's kind of really amplified now. Like audiences now, fan communities particularly, I think are in some cases like hyper aware of their own identity and the desire to be seen in a particular way.
Yes.
By not just like the objects of their affection, their fandom, like the pop group they're a fan of potentially, but also by other fan groups, warring factions on social media and stuff like this, like trying to let's get the name of the new album trending on Twitter and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
So there's that almost sort of self-awareness.
Absolutely.
It's not just other people seeing the crowd as a text. The crowd themselves are seeing themselves as a text.
Well, that leads us on quite nicely to the final sections that I want to discuss. So we'll come on to that idea of like what it means to the people who are involved. I've got another picture, and it's quite similar to a picture that you described earlier. I don't think it's exactly the same because I don't think the police officers I don't think it's the famous one.
It's not exactly the same, but yeah, it's similar.
Yeah. So there's loads of pictures that look like this. And I think this also potentially gives us another way of interpreting Beatlemania that I'm not sure has been discussed socially, politically, culturally nearly as much. So in the picture, we'll post it on all our socials so you can have a look at it. You've got a couple of hundred girls who are being pushed into what looks to be potentially a road. You've got police officers who are trying to push them back. You've got a lot of people who, look like they're a little bit uncomfortable. I'm going to ask you a question. Have you ever been in a crowd where you felt perhaps unsafe?
I have. At music festival that I went to in Ireland. Actually, a few gigs, like music gigs that I've been to. But yeah, I have quite vivid memories of a crowd that I was in that was absolutely packed. We were waiting to see. It was Ash and then Muse were coming on together. One after the other, and it was so tightly packed that you couldn't move, and you were basically, even if you had fallen over, you would be held up by the fact that you were so tightly packed in.
Yeah.
But it was moving in that sort of, anyone who's been in a crowd like this will know exactly.
It's a horrible feeling.
It's a horrible feeling. It's like a sea. Right, the whole crowd turns into kind of like wave, and you don't really have any control over where you're going or not going. And in that moment, a section of the crowd fell over, and there was a bit of a pile up kind of thing.
Yeah.
What I was very pleased with, though, as scary as it was, the whole crowd immediately went into protect each other kind of mode.
Yeah.
And we're really looking out for each other and trying like, okay, just hang on a second, like back, like the bigger people were trying to sort of like act as a little bit of a barrier to give people who had fallen over space to stand up, trying to help pull them up and things like that. It took a while, but there was a nice, as much as it was really scary, there was also kind of a nice moment of solidarity as well.
Yeah. So similarly, I've been in crowds where it feels scary and nothing happens. But I think you do have this moment where you realize of like, I'm surrounded by hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands occasionally of people where if something goes wrong, this could go really badly wrong really, really quickly. And there's not a lot that I can do about that. I was struck early on when I was doing the research for this, one of those opening quotes that we started the podcast with, it really struck me that like what was happening there was potentially actually nothing to do with the person themselves. And if we listened a little bit more to people's experiences within those crowds, what we might find is actually they're not collapsing through hysteria, they're collapsing through something else. And as I was doing the research, I had a couple of quotes. I was like, oh, I had a thesis, and my thesis has been demonstrated. So the first quote is pulled from The Guardian. It's from a 15-year-old girl who wrote into The Guardian herself to explain what her experience of being in a crowd queuing for tickets was like. I'm going to get you to read it.
Okay. She recalls the unnerving experience of realising my feet were not on the ground and the smell of hot bodies and cheap hair lacquer. It was not surprising that people were fainting at the rate of 1 every 5 minutes. Some people were being crushed against the stone wall and shop windows. Others, suffering from claustrophobia, broke down completely. I've been in crowds like that as well, even ones which haven't collapsed. I've been the person at the front who's, getting past water from the security guards in front, and even like hosed down with water in one gig that I went to because everyone was so packed in and so hot, even though it was outdoors. Yeah.
What I think we know in 2024, 50, 60, 70 years after the kind of first emergence of this sort of pop cultural text, is that managing crowds requires loads and loads and loads of work.
Yeah.
We know certainly after the Hillsborough disaster in the UK, which is a very famous football stadium disaster where 96 people died, and then people have died since through different means. The way that you manage a crowd is really, really important to the crowd safety. Up until the 1980s and the 1990s, certainly in the UK, and I think this is true in pop music, the idea of the crowd is you manage them as a problem. And if there's a problem in what takes place in the stadium, you blame them. Because they've been badly behaved. So some of those discourses we've looked at earlier, I think, contribute to this. I have a radical theory that Beatlemania is something that actually happens all over the place, all of the time. We've just got much, much better at managing crowds. We've got much better at putting on pop concerts. I think part of what is happening with Beatlemania is 19th century infrastructure and policing practices are actually intersecting with 20th and 21st century pop music fandom. If you look at a list of where the Beatles were playing, and we saw this in the clip earlier of like older women whose job is to manage a cinema. If you look at a list of where the Beatles played in 1963 and 1964, they are in places where people shouldn't be playing. There is not water. There are not crash, bouncers and stage management and all of these other things. So I have this theory, and that it's absolutely nothing to do with hysteria. And we've created a cultural idea of like the collapsing hysterical female, where actually they're in a crowd and it's really dangerous. And if they're collapsing, there's something quite worrying going on there. So I think there's something quite interesting there of like, the girl is explaining what is happening potentially in these crowds, and we just ignore them for 70 years.
We're the white goddess.
Yeah, it's the white goddess, exactly. Like, let's interpret this crowd. And I think there's something really interesting when you do that of like, all of these years later, if you listen carefully, you go, oh, okay, it might have been quite dangerous. Actually, there might have been other things taking place within these crowds that we need to think about. What I want to end on is just the value, I suppose, of what happens when you actually listen to individuals as individuals who are in the crowd, rather than always trying to read them as a kind of cultural text that kind of provide insights into society and culture. And I don't want to disregard that, by the way, because I think it's fine to do all of those things. But I would say that if we are going to have those interpretations, we should probably build them on the voices of the people who are fans.
100%.
And I've got loads of quotes, and I'm not sure I necessarily need to read all of them, but these are quotes that were either taken at the time. So some journalists did speak to fans themselves. So those journalists, the kind of 200 journalists who were with the 3,000 people, there's a lot of vox pops, there's a lot of talking heads, there's a lot of fans writing to newspapers themselves, and there's also an incredible oral history and Beatles studies community that have pulled these together. So I just wanted to shout out to all of the people that I've read in researching this and the people that used fans' voices in their own research. So all of these quotes come from those, and they'll be available in the show notes. Candy Leonard, Andre Millard, Gary Berman, Andrew Hunt, Kenneth Womack, and Kit O'Toole, and there's other people as well. They've done such a wonderful job on this. It's something that I think we should do more of. In the research, I found one of these talking heads, and I love her so much that I just had to include her because I think she's brilliant. Interviewed by a journalist on television, she's Adrienne from Brooklyn.
I love them. I don't care what anybody thinks. I love the Beatles for them, and I'll always love them. Even when I'm 105 and an old grandmother, I'll love them. And Paul McCartney, if you are listening, Adrienne from Brooklyn loves you with all her heart. I love you, Paul, and please come to the window so I can just see you. I saw you smoking before, and I kissed the limousine you looked at him. But I love you, and I want you, Paul. Please look at it. And Ringo, you can look at it, too, because I like you.
Amazing. She's my new hero. Legend, icon. Can we have her as a co-presenter?
She's so good, isn't she? What a character. And I think there's just, again, when you hear these voices, you can hear, like, there is a playfulness to it.
Yeah,
there's a pleasure,
yeah.
even at that age, of, like, it's not completely serious. It is, but it also isn't. She's really enjoying it.
Yeah, the whole persona. Kind of kissing the window of the limousine.
So
like,
good.
And Ringo, I guess you can come too. Like,
yeah. So again, when you start to kind of listen to the voices as voices, what begins to develop is, again, I don't think it's necessarily that surprising for us, for people who've done any sort of research with fans. Quite immediately, community becomes a thing that lots and lots of people talk about. There's really sweet, like adorable stories of pen pals that kind of join fan clubs, and they, particularly in the UK and American kind of counterparts, writing together and like being friends forever, and they're kind of still in touch with each other, like the exchanging of gifts, all of these other things. One fan member at the time said, or later on, this is them reflecting on their time of being a Beatles fan, we were a community, almost a family. Somebody else suggests it cemented friendships with girls you normally would not have known. So this is girls who are local to you, but girls who are kind of far away as well. So I think there's something really there of like the pleasure. The Beatles are important to this, but they're not the only thing that's going on here. Is friendship. It's developing a sense of self that is rooted in other people who feel something similar to you. There's a really interesting, when you start to hear people's description of the screaming, there's a lot going on with the screaming, but one thing it is not is hysterical. Yeah. So there's really interesting bits of research of like groups of friends talking before they go to the show. Are we going to scream? Making a decision, a collective decision, then be like, well, I'm going to scream, but I'm not going to do it whilst the songs are on. I'm going to do it after the songs finishes.
Wow, okay.
And then like other people being like, oh, well, I'm just going to scream, and like I've just made a decision. And other people again being like, well, I'm not going to scream at all. I'll scream at the start of the show and at the end. Like just really interesting, like rational. One thing that is it is a rational decision beforehand.
Yeah, even if not all the screaming and all the noise is that calculated to that degree, which it probably isn't.
Yes.
But that's really interesting to know that at least some of that happened. And yeah, I guess it's just a testament to the fact that, yeah, as you said before with Adrienne from Brooklyn, this is often, it's part of the game, is your own performance is part of the fun. You're going to see the Beatles, but you also get to be a Beatlemaniac, right? Like you're playing a role when you're doing that.
Yeah. One of the few interviews from one of the few qual studies of there's one that I could found, which is a psychologist. One of the good ones, actually. He goes out and he interviews people. Like, who'd have thought it? He speaks to the girls themselves. And again, he gets really diverse reactions, which again isn't surprising for anyone who does audience research.
Yeah.
But the idea that, people within the fandom themselves are kind of disagreement. He finds one girl who says she likes screaming simply because it's not often that you can scream and get away with it, which I find very profound. Well, I'm going to do it because where else can you do it?
Yeah, and again, I don't mean to keep mentioning football just because I happen to be a football fan and you are as well, but I think it's a nice counterpoint to kind of this debate about hysterical young girls. And why there's so many examples of this across history, and more recently with Twilight and boy bands and things like that, and even obviously before the Beatles. But why is that labelled as hysteria when I can go and watch 11 men kick a ball around a pitch who I've never met and
sing and scream
and frankly act in a way that I would never act in any other aspect of my life.
Absolutely. Again, in any fandom that you've ever been part of, you will know this if you have been part of a fandom. There was a lot of disagreement amongst fans themselves about whether screaming was actually good or whether people were ruining it or whether you could hear the music. Again, I think there's an infrastructure question there of I think screaming still happens at pop concerts. I think we've just got better sound systems. So famously, the Shea Stadium shows that the Beatles did, they channeled all of the music through the announcer speakers. That's it. These are echoey baseball stadiums that are going through very, very small announcer. So it's the kit in the middle of the pitch, and there is the very, very tiny, tinny things. I think at any festival these days you would hear similar noises, but people are trying to work out what to do there. So again, when you start to speak to people, that sense of oh, she was really annoying, the person next to me. I wanted to listen to the show and she wouldn't shut up. So even then, the image of hysteria and fans being overwhelmed.
Or they just have terrible opinions. They're shouting something, you just don't agree with it. It's not that you object to the shouting or the screaming. It's well, she's screaming at Ringo and I don't like Ringo. Or,
Absolutely, yeah. Bickering in fandoms, that happens. There's a really nice quote from somebody who kind of reflects on their time as being a Beatle fan. And she kind of suggests, I like their independence and wanted those things for myself. We were so stifled. If only I could act that way and be strong, sexy, and doing what you want. Somebody else suggests, I tasted something. I was totally going outside of myself. It was freedom. Once you tasted it, you had to have more. The way you lost yourself in the crowd. Yeah. Again, for all the things we can say about it, that is a rational, that is somebody kind of articulating an experience in a very kind of interesting and mature way, and that is after the fact. That's people reflecting on their own experiences, but there's certainly something there. I think
the other thing I really like about those quotes is that so often when people try to explain any kind of cultural phenomenon, anything that's super popular or super controversial or whatever, they often look at the text, the thing itself. So in this case, the Beatles, right? But actually what they should be doing is looking at the fans, the audiences, the people who are enamored with this pop culture object or text, and thinking about, well, what are they bringing to the table?
Yeah.
Because usually it's the object is not quite irrelevant or incidental, but it's it could just as easily have been something else that performed the exact same role or function in that person's life. In this case, the Beatles seem to fit the bill for loads of people and loads of reasons.
Yeah.
But wasn't necessarily making fans do that.
Yeah. And then the final quote, I just am always interested when you have a phenomenon like this. The final quote is from somebody who, I quote, only interested to see them because such a fuss was made of them. I love the idea that even in the 60s, somebody just goes to see the Beatles and they're like, oh, all right, yeah, got Beatlemania, yeah, but decent. Well, yeah, that's it.
But then, actually, we saw that in the Lady Chatterley's Lover episode as well, didn't we?
We did.
The people get queuing up to oh, well, there's a lot of fuss about this book. So, and that was around the same time.
So in any crowd, at any point in history, there's probably stragglers who are just wanted to see what. Yeah. There's probably people there who think it is fun to cause a riot. There's probably people there who have a very deep political attachment to it. And there's probably people there who are it's something to do in it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, there's something that you only get when you actually start to talk to people as people. So, Rich, what did we learn? There's a couple of things that I think we can take from this episode. The first is that the idea of locating a cause and effect between a media text and an audience. I think we've already established that it's really, really difficult. But when it's something as complex as millions of people or hundreds of thousands of people and their own experiences and relationship to a band like the Beatles is just quite messy. It's just quite complicated. It is a lightning rod for understanding other bigger things that are taking place in society, but it's never just that. And we can only really get to what is probably going on if we actually listen to and take seriously individual voices. We live in a society where some voices are heard more than others, and teenage girls are probably one of the groups that if we'd listen to a little bit more, we'd get loads of interesting details. But also we possibly move quite quickly away from hysteria. There's a lot going on materially, politically, and other things like that.
Cool.
I think, judging by the noise, Rich, our fans, they found out where we are, and I think we need to get out of here pretty quickly. So thank you for listening. I've been Ben.
You say goodbye. I say hello. My name is Rich.
If you like what we do, please subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen to. Please leave a review or recommend us to a friend. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at IllEffectsPod. We'll be back in 2 weeks. You've been listening to Ill Effects. This episode was researched by Ben Litherland. It was produced by Rachel Wood. It was produced and edited by Caroline Pringle. Edited and mixed by Colin Frank. The music for our episodes was created by Brutalist, Colin Frank and Maria Sappho, and recorded and mixed by Joe Chrisman.